First, the money ran out. Then, the police ran out. Then, the government ran out. Then, the food ran out. Even the ammo ran out. Then, the people ran out. And now, I walk alone.
Tell me, where are you from? Yeah, I know. Stupid question nowadays. Everybody's from everywhere. You know, I think about how life was before it all went down. Back in 2020, when this all started. I mean, it didn't really start then because, you know, I remember when people would talk about 2020 as being the big bad year and how, you know, there was this meme going around at the time that, you know, oh, it's just 2020, so, you know, cities are blowing up and people are rioting in the streets and pandemic and the fires and all that stuff. And it was almost kind of a joke now that I look back at it. People weren't really serious. Because compared to life right now, 2020 was a cakewalk. I would give anything to go back to how things were in 2020, back before the real pandemic. There was a lot of stuff that started that year, you know, there's just tension everywhere. You know, if you would think that we would know that it was all pointing towards this direction, but there was this faith almost that things were going to get better. There was this hope that the world was going to pull through this and that everything was going to get better. But deep down in the pits of our soul, we knew that something bad was coming and that this was the beginning of it. You know, looking back now, hearing those news reports about how it was a record wildfire season, you know, before the droughts began, before the real food shortages began, and the real riots began. Things really went bad in the fall of 2021. Something happened. I'm not a scientist. I can't explain it. All I know, people smarter than me claim that there was some interaction between the people who were vaccinated and the ones who were not, and it created some kind of super mutant virus which basically had the same lethality rate as the MERS coronavirus. That was around 20%. 20% of people gone. Because by that time, you need to understand that, you know, people didn't trust the government anymore. Most people lost faith, even the most compliant and the most willing to follow. They did not trust the government anymore. And the reason why it's evident to me now is that the government knew how bad this was. They knew that this was bad. That's why there was such a crazy overreaction at the start, and that nobody could really understand. Even the people who believed them couldn't understand it when you looked at the numbers, but it made sense later on. It was around that time when the droughts started. It was just a perfect storm, man. It was just fires were lighting everywhere. I'm talking metaphorical and literal fires were burning everywhere. There was drought all up the breadbasket of North America, way down to Mexico. It's one of the worst crop yields in North American history. The parts of the prairie that weren't parched burned. record forest fires, completely exhausted the infrastructure. Power outages became more frequent. And then, of course, there was this stuff that was starting in the Middle East, and nobody was really even expecting that, but it kind of made sense at the time that people thought things were getting back to normal. It was almost, in a very twisted sort of way, as bad as it was almost like, okay, like we're going back to normal stuff now. Sad to say that, man, but there was this part of people that was like, okay, this is a sign that things are back to normal. But nobody thought that it was going to escalate the way it did. Other countries started getting involved. Iran got sucked into the whole thing. And that's when that situation just got blown out of control. So by the time fall came around and this COVID-21 reared its ugly head, the cyber attacks got worse because the two sides involved in the Middle East conflict were starting to test each other. Supply chains completely broke down. It wasn't a question of, do I get a vacation this year? It wasn't a question of, do I have disposable income? People in North America weren't worried about evictions. They were worried about whether or not they were going to eat. And that's when the food riots started. Around the same time, people were still immigrating in droves, especially because of the stuff that was starting to flare up in the Middle East into European countries. And people were fleeing Mexico, which had devolved into a COVID nightmare of crime, drought, food shortages. So civil unrest started to take root everywhere. Everywhere there was still something to be had, worth having, people started to fight. Conditions just deteriorated from there. It was the hottest year on record. Even if you were a off-gridder, homesteader, you would have struggled to grow food that year unless you had a really good source of water. It just seemed like everything happened at once, man. Like you couldn't make a movie about this because it would be too big of a budget to make this fucking movie. It was crazy. There was plagues, locusts inundating the third world, which was ravaged by COVID-21. Going back to those early reports in India, we should have known something was going on when there was bodies floating in the Ganges River every day. When people in the rural communities were telling reporters, in spite of the overwhelming media silence, that thousands of extra people were dying every day, when the most conservative estimates were that 10 times the amount of people were dying than what were actually being documented. We should have listened, but we didn't. Everything started to fall apart. When the supply chain started to break down and the hospitals became overwhelmed, people started fighting for medical supplies. And I don't just mean fighting, I mean getting violent to the point of killing one another. People resorted to violence to protect the ones they love. And you would have thought that after a year like 2020, people would have got a clue. People would have took a hint from nature or just from the conditions that we were in, that maybe you should take this preparedness thing seriously. But after 2020, it's like everybody went right back to sleep. They didn't think it was going to get worse than that. Everybody thought, okay, we're going to get a vaccine and this is going to be fine, but oh man, were they ever in for a surprise. When people started dropping like flies, when pandemonium started to swell in all of the medical clinics and healthcare facilities, and all of the overflow facilities that the government tried to build, when the military started to get more aggressive in how they were dealing with the situation, it was almost a losing battle at that point. I'm surprised they were able to hold on as long as they could after the fall of 2021, because things deteriorated fast. They talked about that curve before, about how flattening the curve was so important, but nobody really had a frame of reference for that, and people were so fed up with the governments wanting to regulate every little aspect and the lies that they were telling people. People just didn't believe a word anymore. Even the most gullible ones. They just didn't believe a word of it. Because the government cried wolf so much, boy did it bite them in the ass. Boy did it bite us in the ass. You know, in 2020, preppers, that's what we called ourselves back then. That word is utterly meaningless now. There is no longer any fantasy about this. I'm not a prepper anymore. I'm a guy who's trying to survive. But around 2020, we preppers, we were starting to feel a little bit vindicated, because the things that we were saying were finally starting to unfold, even though we didn't want those things to unfold, and it's what we had prepared for. People finally were giving us a little bit of respect for the common sense approach to life that we were taking. But 2021, man, I was scared. When things started to go sideways later that summer, when people realized that food production was going to be at an all-time low on an already strained supply chain in the thick of a developing world war, cyber attacks mounting, drought-stricken, and this new strain which appeared to be resistant to anything they could throw at it, and every booster they tried to throw at it, it just got stronger and stronger and stronger. You could not prepare for the desperate people banging on your door. Particularly me, because I was this public figure. I wasn't popular in a global sense. I only had 500,000 followers on a YouTube channel. It was this thing you watched, you could upload videos to. I wasn't that popular in the grand scheme of things, but people who knew who I was, and you could only hold them off so long. You try to curry the favor of people within your community by providing them a little bit of stuff just to tie them over, but it was never enough, and they always started looking at you sideways. You seriously could never trust anybody but your own flesh and blood. That's a sad, sad thing. Because when it all came down to it, when it came down to my tribe or your tribe and who's starving, that's when people started to look sideways. That's when people started to get snake eyes. And that's when the crime, the real crime, started to happen. By winter of 2021, crime was rampant. And in the years that followed, the situation just got progressively worse. But the last quarter of 2021 is when it all went to hell. That's when it started to really devolve. Now, unless you're part of a gang or you have really good connections, you don't survive. Fortunately, I'm a good negotiator. I'm a good diplomat. These new strains are getting more aggressive. It's only a matter of time before the button gets pushed. I'm talking about the big button. We've come so close. Chinese making their threats, the Russians making their threats. It's just, it's an insane time to be alive, and I don't know if we're going to pull through this. I truly don't know. if humanity is going to pull through this. Nobody wants to work. Everybody's scared to work. In order to get people to work, you basically need to provide them 24/7 security for one. And they need to work with full personal protective equipment, which is incredibly limiting and tedious. And if it wasn't for the machines working 24/7, our flame would be extinguished right now. I'm sure of it. But thankfully, those machines keep us alive. But even the godforsaken machines are starting to seem too smart. It's another level of control and this whole dystopian nightmare that I don't think any of us really anticipated. The tyranny of artificial intelligence and robotic police state in the thick of the crumbling of civilization. There was this one movie, Elysium, which kind of depicts how things are now. Our technology is not that sophisticated yet, but it's getting there, and it's scary. This is my buddy Sniper. He's the only friend I got now. His dad was named Marshall. Fortunately, Marshall had some babies right before things started to go down. Sniper was the only one that made it out. He's a good dog. These German Shepherds, man, they're built for war. When things start to go crazy, this dog turns into a different animal altogether. But he's disciplined enough to know when not to bark and to know when to bark. There was times where we got so hungry where I thought I was going to have to eat him. Still do. The only thing keeping us alive right now are the rations, which are doled out by the government, whatever remains of it. Or you could go be one of those people who lives in the woods. And I've tried that. That's what the crossbow is for. If they catch you with a gun now, you don't get any rations. So people hide them. I'll never get rid of this crossbow though, because push came to shove, if I had to go and push bush, I would need this. It's great because it's silent. You can hunt undetected. There's strict laws now for hunting. If you get caught, it's big trouble. And they don't have prison facilities like they did back in the day to hold people in. They put an end to that when the food riots started. Sometimes I forget my own name. You know, it's been probably 7 years since somebody called me by my name. That's how lonely this world is. You wonder who you are. All those things that we defined ourselves by were dependent on all of the culture and the novelty that we enjoyed. All the stuff. That's how we defined ourselves. But now, people are only defined now by whether they're good or bad. It all boils back down to that. Are you a good one or are you a bad one? Are you somebody that can be trusted or are you a backstabber? Everything revolves around that. That's the only personality trait that really matters anymore. You know, we forgot how simple people actually were. In the thick of that, when we were at our best, arguably our worst as a species, right before the whole freak show burned down, at the height of it all, we were the most confused about what we really were And what we really were boiled down to either you're a good person or you're a bad person. Most people were good. But when things came down to the wire, that same element that made them good, that same element that made them love their children, made them step over anybody to feed those children and do anything to feed those children. They say that 80% of the population has passed away, but there's really no real way to tell. Nobody's doing a census. Nobody's counting the bodies. Bodies are immediately burned, cremated. For all we know, it's being fed back to us. There's this movie one time called Soylent Green. I tell you, man, I hear stories. I don't even want to think about it, but I hear stories of what's going on out there right now, and it scares the shit out of me. Because people are hungry, people are desperate. People are fighting tooth and nail just to keep the lights on. And I don't mean the lights. We don't have lights anymore. Power is something we lost a long time ago. I'm talking about the lights in here. People are trying to do anything they can to keep those lights on, hoping that someday we're going to bounce back from the brink. This was nature's way of putting us in our place and reminding us of how small we really were and how little control we really had. This had to happen so that maybe on the other side of this hell, we can find some sort of lasting peace. But for the time being, try to keep smiling out there, guys, because this is only the beginning.